So last episode I split the crankcase in half with the intention of applying a new layer of sealing compound to prevent any leaks, but also wanted to take a quick look at the rod bearings and the crank journal, just to make sure everything looks satisfactory. So when it comes to pistons, they're connected via wrist pins, which are retained by two of these little clips on either side. You only have to remove one to slide the pin out. Having it fly across the room is not optional. After that, the pin can slide out the rod and free the piston. Now you can more clearly see the operation of the crank. Both rods share the same journal on V-twins. Anyway, I decided to mark one side of the rod and cap with a Sharpie just to make sure I put it back the same way it came out. I made sure to undo the rod nuts as evenly as possible. So there's the crank journal exposed. It's coated in oil and there was no visible wear, so that's the relief. To get the other rod out, you just have to lift it up and lift it up to the same place and then orient it the same way like you did the first one. So the crank journal and the rod bearings, they look good. I showed the rod bearings in front of the camera, but I have no idea what happened to that video file, so just take my word for it. I mean, you can kind of see it here, actually. You have to put the rod you took out second back in first, because that's the one that goes first on the journal. Torque setting is 34.7 foot-pounds. And the manual said nothing about, not reusing these nuts, so I went ahead and reused them while, carefully tightening them down in stages. After this, I very much understand V-twins as just single cylinders with an extra mutated cylinder added onto it. The two halves of the crankcase are sealed together via two O-rings and the sealant around the edges. This gasket kit has at least one of those O-rings, it looks like, but there's this black one at the bottom, and the kit does not come with a black O-ring, and I put one of the reds in there, but it looked like it was slightly too small in my eyes. I don't know what you think. So I just left the original black one in there because it was actually in unusually good shape. The top one was the same size and color, so I just replaced that as normal. When it came to prepping the edges of the cases, I began by removing the old silicone and dirt with a plastic razor on both halves. Some parts I had to use an actual razor, if they were enough of a problem. Honestly, I think scraping away gasket surfaces is up there as one of my least favorite things to do when it comes to working on engines. The manual calls for Yamaha 4 on this job, so that's what we got. Just gotta apply it by hand. There's two dowels and two O-rings that you gotta make sure are in place when putting these back together. But other than that, it's as simple as lining up the bearings. It's a lot easier than getting them off after 40 years of being stuck together. This here is the installation and torque sequence of the case bolts. For now, I'm just using the original bolts because I plan to clean and paint the crankcase. so these will be a good way to mask off those holes. Later on, I'll replace them with stainless steel ones. Of course, the sealant has to cure, so I managed to give it 5 days, which is plenty of time, way more time than you need. Now that the sides are ready to come back together, I can install the new clutch plates. So when installing new plates, you must soak them in oil for a few hours or whatever works for you. You know, there's a lot of different opinions on that, but I use an aluminum pan and some cheapo Fram oil that I had sitting around that I didn't really mind effectively wasting on something like this. Granted, I did put the oil right back in the bottle afterwards. The first actual task was cleaning up the cylinder base surfaces. They cleaned up pretty nice, and any blemishes that you can see, you can't actually feel. Like, I can't feel them with my fingernail. Alright, clutch side. First up is the sprocket that's mounted to the crank with the little prism-shaped key. The red stuff that you see on there is assembly lube. I didn't torque it down yet because I need the clutch in there first before I do that. When it comes to the cam sprocket, it's actually a split gear meant to minimize like gear lash. So it's loaded with springs that have to be pushed in with an Allen key so you can line up the teeth. For timing, these dots have to be lined up. Alright, now for the clutch basket. Now there's a clutch locker tool that allows you to torque it down with a breaker bar, or like, you know, a big ratchet, but I don't have it, so I just blasted it with the air impact and then refolded the lock washer. Now for the actual friction plates. So by this point, I believe the plates were soaking for about 4 hours, which is more than enough. You can actually see just how much material is lost on the old ones in comparison with the new ones. The order is basically start with a friction plate, alternate with the metal plates, and then you should end with a friction plate. I then reinstalled the cover and springs. At this point, the manual calls for using a rag jammed into the gears so you could torque that crank nut back on. And that's literally the clutch side complete. But now for the flywheel side, starting with the oil pump assembly. I wanted to give the oil pump a quick clean and inspection before reinstalling it, and I noticed a heavy amount of wear inside the pump, like a level of scoring that I could feel with my finger. So I decided to order a replacement. I ended up going with a pump from a 1995 1100 bike. It's all the same part number throughout the years, and that bike had 9,000 miles, so it has a better chance of being in good shape. But I still wanted to do something, so I shifted my aim at the engine covers. Now the plan here is to clean them and then use them as masks for when I paint the block. Then the covers would eventually go in for powder coating. I think this gasket was replaced at some point because it came off really suspiciously easy. The other half of the charging system and all that was still in this cover, so I pulled them out. I opted to use a bunch of wire brushes on a drill, which was also scuffing the surface of the metal for better paint adhesion. Now, I was indoors, so I couldn't just blast the stuff with a brake cleaner. I had to use something a little less harsh that was lying around. Alright, this probably took about 8 hours spread over 2 days, but eventually I made it around the entire block and I masked the engine off for paint. The side covers and cylinders do a great job of masking as is, and then whatever else was left, I used masking tape and paper towels. I was gonna just run bare aluminum color, like the actual spray color, for the block, but when I got to Advanced Auto, they didn't actually have any. But they did have this, and I was actually intrigued. Basically, it's made to mimic the color and texture of cast iron, but it also reminds me of that one color that Ducati tends to use on the magnesium engine covers. It's not exactly that color, but there's a faint hint of like a dull gold in the light, but otherwise it just looks gray. So here was my state-of-the-art paint booth, just the landing of a staircase. Now you could imagine it would be tough to film in there, so I did not. But here's the result of 3 coats of primer, 3 coats of color, and I think like 2 clears. I did it by painting everything I could see on one side for a coat, and then flipping the engine and doing the other side. It took as long as it sounds like it would. But anyway, we'll get back to that later. I had to let the paint cure in, so I shifted my attention to the heads, which I had yet to disassemble. So in order to remove valves and the associated components, you need a specific tool that sort of looks like a C-clamp with a hollow end. This is my cheapo one from the CB550 build. It's simple, you just have to select the correct attachment for the width of the spring cap, and then use the pin on the dish of the valve. And once the tool is lined up, you just crank down on the pin side, and that'll compress the spring. When it compresses enough, these little half-moon retainers will free up, and if they don't fall out, you can use a magnet to fish them out. I recommend giving the tool a wiggle every few cranks because sometimes it's all stuck together and it just needs to be like laterally popped loose rather than be cranked on harder. For each valve you got 2 retainer clips, 2 springs, 2 washers, and a valve seal. The bottom washer kind of sticks in place due to the oil on it, so I used a magnet to get it out. I put it all away in the little organizer, then I went after the next valve. I like doing valves. It's like a nice, mindless, repetitive job that's kind of hard to screw up. So here are what the valves themselves look like. About as messy as you'd expect, honestly. These will be vapor blasted as well, at which point they'll be much easier to inspect. But with that, the first head was done and I did the second one off camera. Now here are the valves for the second head. Okay, so at this point I put the heads in a milk crate and I also removed the jugs from the painted block and put them in there as well. I reached out to Displaced Moto Co. for their vapor blasting service under the name Brooklyn Vapor Blasting, and Kevin, the fellow who runs it, gave me a price that I really liked. It was Sunday and thus traffic was light, so I offered to bring the parts by that same day, and I was told that it would be fine, so off I went. The regular garage by the name of Displaced Moto is one of many community garages around Brooklyn. It's where people store and work on their bikes. You know, if they don't have the luxury of a safe parking spot or workplace. It's funny because I spent more time here talking to Kevin, the owner, than I did working out the deal. You give two bike builders a few beers and they'll just talk for hours and hours. I really wish I had a decent workspace, you know, it would honestly help out with the anxiety of doing all this. Anyway, Kevin told me that the parts will be ready the next day. So when I went home, I made sure to install those polished stainless bolts. I like this kit because everything is labeled, you know, in accordance to letters. It's recommended that you use anti-seize because the bolts are steel and the case is aluminum, and two different metals in contact under heat cycles may corrode and seize up. Now, I'll admit that under the indoor light, the oversprayed bolts don't look terribly different than the stainless ones, but they should pop when the engine is outdoors, especially, you know, when they're over black side covers. Oh, here's a better look at the paint on the block. Also, here's a look at the magic Kevin worked on my parts. I went and grabbed them on my Revzilla lunch break the next day, as promised. It was the 2 heads, 2 cylinders, 2 pistons, and all 4 valves as well. He uses a glass vapor, which isn't too harsh, but still makes the parts look damn near new. It's actually kind of insane. Very much a job well done. I plan to do satin black cylinders and cast iron heads, you know, the same color as the block for the heads. And again, with the side covers being black as well. I decided to just, you know, dry fit the parts to get a shot of the engine all cleaned up, and here it is. I wish the lighting was better, but you can still see just how much better everything here looks. So, what happens now? Well, next episode I have to finish the flywheel side, you know, double check the new oil pump, gather all the parts that I want powder coated and drop them off, as well as paint and reassemble the head. I believe the next episode should wrap up all the engine stuff, and thank God, because I'm getting kind of bored of it. I'm still holding parts, you know, here's a little sneak peek. But yeah, very straightforward episode this time, but I hope you enjoyed. You just watched the Illustrator. This was episode 3 of my Yamaha Virago XV920 build series, and I'll see you on the next one.